Montana Territory, 1875. A relentless drought had scorched the land for months, turning the once verdant valley into a sea of parched earth. Hayes Barrett stood on the weathered porch of his modest ranch house, surveying what remained of his struggling cattle operation. At 25, the weight of the world seemed to rest on his broad shoulders. The setting sun cast long shadows across the Bitterroot Valley, painting the distant mountains in hues of purple and gold, a beauty that only emphasized his profound isolation. Hayes had inherited the Crooked Pine Ranch after his father succumbed to pneumonia 2 winters past. His mother had died years earlier, leaving Hayes as the sole heir to 300 acres of rolling hills, a small herd of cattle, and endless solitude. "This land takes more than it gives," he muttered to himself, a mantra he'd adopted since burying his father. The frontier had taught Hayes one undeniable truth: attachment meant inevitable loss. Everyone who mattered eventually vanished into the unforgiving wilderness or the cold embrace of the Montana soil. Better to face the harsh realities alone than risk having your heart torn apart again. He'd seen it countless times: pioneers broken by love and loss, their dreams scattered like tumbleweeds across the plains. Hayes had concluded that success on the frontier demanded singular focus. The vulnerability that accompanied love was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when survival required constant vigilance. Each morning, he rose before dawn and worked until his muscles screamed for mercy. He rode fence lines, mended broken corrals, and nursed sickly calves back to health. The ranch hands he employed were transient souls who rarely stayed more than a season, and Hayes preferred it that way. No attachments meant no disappointments. Yet in the quiet evening hours, when the vast Montana sky erupted with stars, an emptiness would settle in his chest. Hayes told himself it was merely fatigue, though deep down he recognized it as loneliness, a weakness he refused to acknowledge. He'd convinced himself that a man could survive on determination alone, that the company of his gelding and cattle dog was sufficient. The town of Pine Ridge lay 15 miles east, a journey Hayes made only when necessity demanded. His reputation there was that of a capable but distant rancher who kept to himself. The local matchmakers had given up their efforts after numerous failed attempts to pair him with eligible young women passing through on stagecoaches or settling with their families. "You need someone to warm that big house, Barrett," Mabel Johnson, the general store owner, would say whenever he came to town for supplies. "House is plenty warm, Mrs. Johnson," he would reply with a tight smile before changing the subject. As Hayes turned to enter his cabin, something caught his eye: a dust cloud rising from the eastern trail. Visitors were rare enough to warrant caution. He reached inside the doorway and retrieved his Winchester rifle, a constant companion in a territory where law remained a distant concept rather than a reliable presence. The approaching rider emerged from a bend in the trail, and Hayes narrowed his eyes against the setting sun. The silhouette was smaller than he expected, not the broad shoulders of a ranch hand or cattle buyer, but the unmistakable figure of a woman on horseback. She rode astride rather than side saddle, her posture confident as she guided her chestnut mare toward the ranch house. As she drew closer, Hayes lowered his rifle slightly, curiosity overcoming caution. The woman wore a practical riding skirt of dusty blue, a crisp white shirtwaist, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded her face. When she finally reached the yard, she pulled her horse to a stop and looked up at him with clear green eyes that struck him with unexpected force. "Are you Hayes Barrett of the Crooked Pine?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight eastern accent, but firm with purpose. "I am," he replied, his hand still resting on his rifle. "And who might you be, riding alone this close to dusk?" She removed her hat, revealing a mass of rich auburn hair pinned loosely at her nape. A few tendrils had escaped, framing a face that combined delicate features with a determined chin. She couldn't have been more than 22 or 23 years old. "Rebecca Vaughn," she answered, dismounting with practiced ease. "I've come about the advertisement you placed in the Pine Ridge Gazette for a ranch cook and housekeeper." Hayes frowned. "That advertisement was placed by my foreman without my knowledge or consent. I've no need for household help." Rebecca raised an eyebrow, glancing pointedly at his cabin. Even from the yard, the disarray within was visible through the open door: unwashed dishes, scattered clothing, and a layer of dust on every surface. "With respect, Mr. Barrett, evidence suggests otherwise." She reached into her saddlebag and produced a folded newspaper clipping. Your advertisement specifically mentioned room and board plus fair wages for someone capable of managing the household affairs of a growing cattle operation. Hayes silently cursed Finn Murphy, his foreman, who had taken it upon himself to improve the ranch's situation. He stepped down from the porch, setting his rifle against the railing. Miss Vaughn, I'm afraid you've had a wasted journey. I've no intention of hiring anyone for the house. I've ridden 15 miles from town, Mr. Barrett, she said, her chin lifting slightly. The stagecoach that brought me to Montana left yesterday. I sold nearly everything I owned to make this journey from Chicago. The least you could offer is dinner and a place to rest before I ride back tomorrow. Something in her steady gaze made Hayes hesitate. There was a story there. A young woman traveling alone to the Montana Territory on the promise of employment that didn't exist. Whatever had driven her to such desperate measures must have been compelling. You can stay the night in the bunkhouse, he finally conceded. It's empty just now. The hands are up in the north pasture with the herd. There's stew on the stove, such as it is. Thank you, she said, but made no move toward the bunkhouse. Instead, she tied her horse to the hitching post and stepped onto the porch, passing by Hayes as if she belonged there. I'll see to dinner first. It's the least I can do for your hospitality. Before Hayes could object, Rebecca had entered his home and was surveying the chaos with a critical eye. He followed her inside, suddenly self-conscious about the state of his living quarters. Miss Vaughn, this isn't necessary. It absolutely is, she interrupted, rolling up her sleeves. No one should live like this, Mr. Barrett. Not even a stubborn rancher determined to do everything himself. As Rebecca moved efficiently around his kitchen, clearing space and somehow transforming his meager stew into something that actually smelled appetizing, Hayes found himself watching her with a mixture of irritation and fascination. There was something disarming about her presence. The way she hummed softly while she worked, the decisive movements of her hands, the quiet confidence with which she inhabited his space. They ate at his small table, the first meal Hayes had shared with anyone in months. Rebecca spoke of her journey west, carefully avoiding any mention of what had prompted her departure from Chicago. Hayes found himself responding with more than his usual monosyllabic answers, sharing details about the ranch and the challenges of the ongoing drought. Why did you really come to Montana, Miss Vaughn? Hayes finally asked as they finished their meal. A young woman like yourself has better prospects than serving as housekeeper on a struggling cattle ranch. A shadow crossed her face. Chicago held nothing for me anymore, she said simply. And sometimes, Mr. Barrett, a fresh start in an untamed place is exactly what's needed. Hayes recognized the look in her eyes, the same determination he'd seen in his own reflection after his father's death. Whatever ghost Rebecca Vaughn was running from, they were substantial enough to drive her across half a continent. That night, as Hayes lay in his bed listening to the coyotes calling in the distance, he found himself thinking about the woman sleeping in his bunkhouse. There was something unsettling about her arrival, as if a stone had been dropped into the still pond of his existence, sending ripples across its surface. He told himself he would send her back to town in the morning with enough money for the next stagecoach east. The last thing he needed was a complication like Rebecca Vaughn. But when dawn broke and Hayes stepped onto his porch with coffee in hand, he discovered Rebecca already at work. She'd collected eggs from the neglected henhouse, started bread dough rising by the stove, and was sweeping his porch with vigorous strokes. Good morning, Mr. Barrett, she said cheerfully. I hope you don't mind. I'm an early riser, and I can't abide idleness. Hayes found himself speechless as she continued her sweeping, humming the same tune from the previous evening. The morning light caught her hair, transforming the auburn strands into a fiery halo around her determined face. Miss Vaughn, he finally managed, I meant what I said yesterday. I can't offer you employment here. Rebecca paused, leaning on her broom. Mr. Barrett, let me propose an arrangement. Allow me 1 week to demonstrate my value. If after 7 days you still believe your household runs perfectly well without assistance, I'll leave without argument. But if I've improved your circumstances, we can discuss more permanent terms. Hayes opened his mouth to refuse, but Rebecca continued before he could speak. Consider the practical aspects. Your hands return from the north pasture soon, according to what you mentioned last night. They'll need meals and clean quarters. You've admitted the drought has you working from sunrise to sunset. Having someone manage the household would free you to focus on saving your herd. Her logic was sound, much as Hayes wanted to deny it. The ranch hands would indeed return hungry and exhausted, and the thought of having properly cooked meals waiting might improve morale during these difficult times. 1 week, he conceded reluctantly. But I won't have you thinking this creates any obligation beyond that. Rebecca's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Excellent. Now, if you'll point me toward your laundry supplies, those sheets have seen better days. The week that followed upended everything Hayes had come to accept about his solitary existence. Rebecca attacked the chaos of his household with methodical efficiency, transforming the ranch house from a bachelor's disorganized shelter into something approaching a home. Surfaces gleamed, cupboards were organized, and meals appeared with astonishing regularity. When Finn Murphy and the other 3 ranch hands returned from the north pasture, they found fresh bread, stewed beef, and apple cobbler waiting. Hayes watched with bemused resignation as his men practically fell over themselves offering to chop extra wood or fetch water for Miss Rebecca. "You never mentioned hiring a housekeeper, boss," Finn said on the 3rd evening as they checked the irrigation ditch near the barn. The Irishman's weathered face split into a knowing grin. "Though I can't say I'm surprised you changed your mind after meeting her. It's a 1-week arrangement," Hayes said firmly. "And it was your advertisement that brought her here in the first place." Finn shrugged unapologetically. "Best decision I never made, then. The girl's a godsend, Barrett. You'd be a fool to send her away." As the week progressed, Hayes found himself increasingly aware of Rebecca's presence. The sound of her humming as she worked, the scent of lavender that somehow clung to his freshly laundered shirts, the way sunlight caught in her hair when she gathered vegetables from the small garden she'd revived behind the house. Against his better judgment, he began sharing more of his evening meals with her, listening to her stories about growing up in Chicago with 3 brothers, her father's work as a clockmaker, her mother's passion for education that had ensured Rebecca could read and cipher as well as any man. What she didn't speak of was why she had left it all behind. The omission hung between them like an unasked question, but Hayes respected her privacy. Everyone in the West carried secrets. It was an unspoken code of the frontier to let the past remain buried unless freely offered. On the 6th day, as Rebecca hung laundry in the yard, Hayes noticed a rider approaching from the direction of town. He recognized the bay gelding of Sheriff Thomas Wilson, and tension immediately tightened his shoulders. The sheriff rarely rode out this far unless trouble was brewing. "Morning, Barrett," Wilson called as he dismounted. His eyes shifted to Rebecca, who had paused in her work. "Ma'am," he added with a tip of his hat. "Sheriff," Hayes acknowledged. "What brings you all the way out to Crooked Pine?" Wilson reached into his vest pocket and produced a folded paper. "Got a telegram from Chicago yesterday. Been asking around town about a woman matching this description." His eyes moved deliberately toward Rebecca, who had grown very still. Auburn hair, green eyes, about 21 years of age. Name of Rebecca Vaughn. Hayes felt rather than saw Rebecca stiffen beside him. "Is there some problem, Sheriff?" he asked carefully. "That depends," Wilson said, his weathered face impassive. "The telegram's from a James Hollister. Says he's looking for his fiancée who disappeared 3 weeks ago, taking family jewelry with her." Hayes turned to Rebecca, whose face had drained of color. Her hands twisted in the damp sheet she'd been hanging. "I'm not a thief," she said quietly but firmly. "And James Hollister is not my fiancé." "The telegram suggests otherwise, ma'am," Wilson replied. "I was engaged to James's brother, Edward," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite her pallor. "Edward died of typhoid 2 months ago. James decided his brother's betrothed should transfer her affections to him, along with the dowry my father had arranged. When I refused, he became insistent. The jewelry was my mother's, my only inheritance from her." "That's convenient," Wilson remarked, though his tone had softened slightly. "It's the truth," Rebecca insisted. "I left because James wouldn't accept my refusal. He has friends in the Chicago Police Department. No one would believe me over him." Hayes studied her face, searching for any sign of deception. He found none, only the same quiet determination he'd observed since her arrival, now tinged with fear. "Sheriff," Hayes said finally, "Miss Vaughn is employed at Crooked Pine Ranch. She's been here over a week now, and I can vouch for her character." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "That right? Funny. I recall you saying not a month ago that you'd sooner wrestle grizzlies than have a woman underfoot at your ranch. People change their minds, Hayes replied evenly. Wilson looked between them, his expression unreadable. Well, I've got no authority to force anyone back to Chicago. But if this Hollister fellow comes looking himself, that's another matter. After the sheriff departed, Rebecca stood frozen by the clothesline, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for another sheet. You didn't have to lie for me, she said without looking at Hayes. I didn't lie, he replied. You are employed here. The week isn't up until tomorrow. Rebecca turned to face him, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. Thank you, but I should leave anyway. I won't bring trouble to your door. Was what you told the sheriff true? About Hollister? She nodded. Every word. Edward and I were to be married in June. After he died, James started calling at my father's house. At first, I thought he was being kind, offering support in our grief. Then he proposed, saying it would honor Edward's memory. When I refused, he became obsessive. He threatened to ruin my father's business if I didn't agree. So you ran. I had no choice. Her chin lifted in that now familiar gesture of defiance. I won't be forced into marriage with a man I don't love, Mr. Barrett. Not even to save my reputation. Hayes found himself admiring her courage. Well, Crooked Pine is a long way from Chicago, he said. And as it happens, I find myself in need of a permanent housekeeper after all. The relief that washed over Rebecca's face made something twist in Hayes's chest. For the first time since his father's death, he felt the stirring of a foreign emotion, a desire to protect someone beyond himself. The arrangement would be strictly professional, he added quickly, uncomfortable with this newfound sentiment. Rebecca smiled, the tension easing from her shoulders. Of course, Mr. Barrett. Strictly professional. But as the summer progressed, maintaining professional distance became increasingly difficult. Rebecca transformed not only Hayes's household, but the entire atmosphere of the ranch. The bunkhouse gleamed with unaccustomed cleanliness. The garden expanded under her care, providing fresh vegetables that improved everyone's diet. She organized the ranch accounts with astonishing efficiency, discovering wasteful expenditures and suggesting practical economies. More unsettling to Hayes was how she gradually transformed the empty rooms of his house into living spaces. She arranged wildflowers in mason jars, hung curtains sewn from feed sacks, and placed a colorful quilt across the back of his father's old chair. Small touches that should have irritated him instead created an unfamiliar sensation of comfort. The ranch hands took to calling her Miss Rebecca with affectionate respect, competing for her attention like schoolboys. Even Hayes's cattle dog, normally suspicious of strangers, had taken to following her around with devoted eyes. Hayes found himself inventing reasons to return to the house during the day. A forgotten tool, a question about supplies, a sudden thirst that required quenching. Each time, he lingered longer than necessary, watching Rebecca at her work or engaging her in conversation that strayed increasingly from ranch matters. She never mentioned James Hollister again, though Hayes sometimes caught her scanning the horizon when riders approached, tension visible in her shoulders until she confirmed it wasn't a stranger from Chicago. He found himself watching for unfamiliar visitors with equal vigilance, his hand straying to his gun belt whenever dust rose from the eastern trail. July brought a blessed break in the drought. Rain fell for 3 days straight, transforming the parched landscape into a sea of green practically overnight. The cattle grew sleek on fresh grass, and the mood at Crooked Pine lightened considerably. One evening, as Hayes returned from checking the revitalized south pasture, he heard music drifting from the house. Following the sound, he discovered Rebecca seated at the small piano in the parlor, an instrument that had sat untouched since his mother's death. Her fingers moved confidently across the keys as she played a familiar hymn, her voice lifting in a clear soprano that sent an unexpected shiver down his spine. He stood in the doorway, unwilling to announce his presence and break the spell. Rebecca's face in profile showed a peaceful expression he rarely witnessed, as if the music transported her away from whatever burdens she carried. When she finished playing, Hayes cleared his throat. Rebecca startled slightly, turning on the piano bench with a flush rising to her cheeks. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "The piano is out of tune, but I managed to adjust it somewhat." "I didn't know you played," Hayes replied, stepping into the room. "My mother taught me." She believed music was essential to a proper education. Rebecca ran her fingers lightly over the keys. This is a beautiful instrument. I haven't played since. Since you left Chicago? Hayes finished for her. She nodded, her eyes distant. There are things I miss. Music. My father. The lake at sunrise. Her gaze returned to Hayes. But I don't regret leaving. Hayes moved closer, drawn by something in her expression. Are you happy here, Rebecca? The question surprised them both. It was the first time he had used her given name without the formal miss preceding it. I am, she answered softly. Happier than I expected to be. A moment of silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Hayes found himself noticing details he'd been trying to ignore. The curve of her cheek, the slight dimple that appeared when she smiled, the way her hair escaped its pins by day's end. The spell broke when Finn Murphy's voice called from outside, announcing a problem with one of the pregnant heifers. Hayes retreated to safer ground, nodding curtly before hurrying to address the ranch emergency. But that night, as he lay in his bed, the melody Rebecca had played echoed in his mind, along with the image of her hands moving across the keys. August brought the cattle drive to the railroad at Helena, where Hayes would sell off the majority of his herd to Eastern buyers. The drought had reduced his numbers, but the surviving cattle were healthy enough to fetch decent prices. The drive would take Hayes and all the ranch hands away for at least 2 weeks, leaving Rebecca alone at Crooked Pine. I don't like leaving you here by yourself, Hayes said as they reviewed the ranch accounts the night before his departure. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away. I'm perfectly capable of managing on my own, Rebecca assured him. I have your shotgun, and I know how to use it. Besides, it's only for 2 weeks. Hayes frowned. If anyone comes looking, I'll be fine, she interrupted gently. No one from Chicago knows where I am. He wasn't convinced, but he had no choice. The cattle had to get to market before prices dropped. Finn will ride back to check on you after we reach Helena, he decided. And if there's any trouble, any at all, you ride for the Petersons' place. Rebecca smiled at his concern. I promised to be sensible, Hayes. It was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it in her voice created a warmth in his chest that both pleased and alarmed him. He was growing far too accustomed to her presence, too dependent on the comfort she brought to his life. The realization only reinforced his determination to maintain emotional distance. The morning of departure arrived with clear skies and moderate temperatures, perfect weather for moving cattle. Hayes found himself lingering over breakfast, inventing last-minute instructions and concerns that Rebecca patiently addressed. The ranch will still be standing when you return, she assured him as he checked his saddlebags for the 3rd time. Just be careful, he said, more gruffly than intended. Rebecca handed him a package wrapped in oilcloth. Fresh bread and smoked beef for the trail. There's apple pie in there, too. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and Hayes felt an electric jolt of awareness. For a breathless moment, they stood closer than propriety allowed, something unspoken passing between them. Then Finn called from the yard that the herd was ready to move, breaking the fragile connection. I'll see you in 2 weeks, Hayes said, stepping back. Rebecca nodded, her expression unreadable. Safe journey. The first week of the cattle drive passed uneventfully. The herd moved at a steady pace toward Helena, and the weather remained cooperative. Yet Hayes found his thoughts constantly returning to Crooked Pine, and more specifically, to the woman he'd left there. He caught himself scanning the horizon in the direction of home, as if he might glimpse the ranch across the many miles that separated them. You're mighty distracted for a trail boss, Finn remarked one evening as they sat by the campfire. Thinking about something particular back home? Or someone? Hayes shot him a warning glance. Just concerned about the ranch. Of course, Finn replied with exaggerated solemnity. The ranch. Not the lovely Miss Rebecca who's been bringing the light back into your eyes these past months. You're overstepping, Murphy, Hayes said sharply. The Irishman shrugged, unperturbed by his employer's tone. Maybe so, but I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper, Hayes Barrett. I watched you withdraw after your pa died, building walls higher than the bitterroots. Now I'm watching those walls come down, brick by brick, every time that woman smiles at you. Hayes stared into the fire, unwilling to acknowledge the truth in Finn's words. She's running from something, he said finally. Someone. When whatever she's afraid of passes, she'll likely move on. Or maybe she's already found what she was looking for, Finn suggested quietly. Same as you have. The next morning, Hayes dispatched Finn back to Crooked Pine as planned, ostensibly to check on the ranch, but primarily to ensure Rebecca's safety. The foreman departed with a knowing smile that Hayes pointedly ignored. They reached Helena 3 days later and completed the cattle sale with better prices than Hayes had anticipated. For the first time in 2 years, the ranch would have a financial cushion for the coming winter. He should have felt triumphant, but instead found himself impatient to begin the journey home. The return trip would be faster without the cattle to herd, and Hayes pushed the pace as much as reasonably possible. He expected to find Finn waiting at the prearranged meeting point, but the foreman was nowhere to be seen. A sense of unease crept over Hayes as they continued toward Crooked Pine. Finn's absence could be innocent. Perhaps he had decided to wait at the ranch, but Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His fears were confirmed when they crested the final ridge overlooking the ranch valley. Even from a distance, Hayes could see that something was amiss. Smoke rose not from the chimney of the ranch house, but from the direction of the barn. He spurred his horse into a gallop, heart pounding against his ribs as he raced down the slope. Drawing closer, he saw that the barn door hung at an angle, partially torn from its hinges. The smoke came from a small fire that had been built dangerously close to the hay storage. The ranch house door stood open, and personal belongings were scattered across the yard as if someone had ransacked the interior. "Rebecca!" Hayes shouted as he dismounted, drawing his revolver. "Rebecca!" No answer came. He approached the house cautiously, signaling for his men to check the outbuildings. The interior of the ranch house had been thoroughly searched, drawers emptied onto the floor, furniture overturned. Rebecca's room showed signs of a struggle, the bedding torn, a water pitcher shattered on the floor. Cold fear gripped Hayes's heart. He was about to rush back outside when he heard a weak groan from the direction of the kitchen. Following the sound, he discovered Finn Murphy lying on the floor behind the stove, a bloody gash across his forehead and his hands bound behind his back. "Finn!" Hayes knelt beside the injured man, quickly cutting his bonds. "What happened? Where's Rebecca?" Finn winced as Hayes helped him into a sitting position. "Hollister," he managed, his voice hoarse. "From Chicago. Came with 2 hired guns. I tried to stop them, but they got the drop on me." He gestured toward his head wound. "Took Miss Rebecca about 3 hours ago, heading east toward Pine Ridge." Rage and terror surged through Hayes in equal measure. "Did they hurt her?" "She was fighting mad when they dragged her out," Finn said. Hollister kept saying she was his fiancée, that he was taking her back to Chicago for their wedding. She was screaming that she'd rather die. Hayes was already on his feet. "Which trail did they take?" "Main road to town. They had a wagon." Finn struggled to stand. "I'm coming with you." "You're staying here," Hayes ordered. "You can barely stand." He turned to the ranch hands who had gathered in the doorway. "Jones, take care of Finn. Matthews, ride for the sheriff. Peters, you're with me." Within minutes, Hayes was galloping toward Pine Ridge, his mind filled with terrible possibilities. James Hollister had found Rebecca, just as she had feared. The man had traveled across half a continent to reclaim what he considered his property. What would he do when Rebecca continued to refuse him? The question drove Hayes to push his horse faster than was wise on the rough trail. They had been riding for nearly an hour when Peters spotted dust rising from the road ahead, the telltale sign of a wagon moving at speed. Hayes felt a surge of desperate hope. If they could intercept the wagon before it reached town, they might have a chance to save Rebecca before Hollister could place her on a train eastbound. As they drew closer, Hayes could make out a wagon with 3 riders, 2 men on horseback flanking a driver. His heart leapt when he caught a glimpse of auburn hair. Rebecca was sitting beside the driver, presumably Hollister himself. "Stay back," Hayes instructed Peters. "If shooting starts, get Rebecca clear." They closed the distance rapidly, finally drawing near enough for Hayes to shout, "Hollister, stop the wagon." The wagon slowed, and the 2 mounted men turned to face the pursuit, hands moving toward their holsters. Hayes kept his focus on the driver, a well-dressed man with a carefully trimmed beard and an expression of annoyed superiority. Beside him, Rebecca's face showed a mixture of fear and dawning hope as she recognized her rescuers. "This doesn't concern you, Cowboy," Hollister called, pulling the wagon to a stop. "This woman is my fiancée. We're simply returning to Chicago." Hayes brought his horse alongside the wagon, his eyes meeting Rebecca's. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded slightly, though he could see bruising on her wrist where someone had gripped her too tightly. Miss Vaughn isn't going anywhere she doesn't choose to go, Hayes said, addressing Hollister directly. And she's made it clear she doesn't choose you. Hollister's face darkened. Rebecca belongs to me. Our engagement was arranged with her father's blessing before my brother's unfortunate death. I never agreed to marry you, James, Rebecca said, her voice trembling but determined. Not before Edward died, and certainly not after. Your agreement is irrelevant, Hollister snapped. A woman needs guidance, especially one as willful as you. Think of your father's business, your family's reputation. Hayes kept his voice level, though rage burned through him at Hollister's dismissive tone. In Montana territory, a woman has the right to choose her own path. Miss Vaughn has chosen to make her home at Crooked Pine Ranch. As what? Hollister sneered. A servant? A frontier harlot? Is that the future you've chosen, Rebecca? Better that than a prisoner in your house, she retorted. Hollister nodded to his hired guns. Remove this interruption, he ordered coldly. The men reached for their weapons, but Hayes was faster. His revolver cleared its holster before either man could draw. The barrel aimed steadily at Hollister's chest. I wouldn't, Hayes advised quietly. My ranch hand behind me has both of your men covered. One wrong move, and you'll never see Chicago again. Hollister's face contorted with fury. You're bluffing. You wouldn't shoot an unarmed man. To protect what's mine? Try me. The words escaped before Hayes could consider their implication, but he realized with sudden clarity that he meant them. Somehow, without his notice or permission, Rebecca had become essential to him, as vital as air or water. Rebecca's eyes widened at his declaration, a flush spreading across her cheeks. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Hollister reached slowly into his coat, producing a small derringer. She's coming with me, he said, pointing the weapon at Rebecca. One way or another. Everything happened in an instant. Hayes lunged forward as Hollister swung the derringer toward him. Rebecca grabbed the man's arm, spoiling his aim as the small pistol discharged harmlessly into the air. The horses reared in panic at the sound, nearly overturning the wagon. Taking advantage of the confusion, Hayes dragged Hollister from his seat, both men tumbling to the dusty road. They grappled in the dirt, Hollister fighting with the desperate strength of a man unaccustomed to physical confrontation but driven by obsession. He managed to land a solid blow to Hayes's jaw before the rancher pinned him, one forearm pressed against his throat. She doesn't want you, Hayes growled. Accept it and leave, or so help me, I'll make sure you never bother her again. Hollister struggled futilely against Hayes's superior strength. You have no idea who you're dealing with, he gasped. I have connections, judges, politicians. I'll see you ruined. Your Chicago connections mean nothing in Montana, Hayes replied, increasing the pressure slightly. Out here, a man stands on his own merits. And yours are sorely lacking. A commotion behind them caused Hayes to glance over his shoulder. Peters had disarmed one of Hollister's men, but the second hired gun was advancing on Rebecca, who had scrambled from the wagon and stood with her back to a large boulder. Hayes released Hollister, spinning to intercept the threat, but before he could move, the sound of a rifle shot cracked through the air. The hired gun froze, then slowly raised his hands as Sheriff Wilson emerged from the trees, rifle trained steadily on the would-be attacker. That's far enough, Wilson called. Next one won't be a warning. Relief washed through Hayes as he saw that Rebecca was unharmed. She rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she touched his bruised jaw. You came for me, she whispered. Of course I did, he answered simply. Wilson and his deputy quickly took control of the situation, disarming and restraining Hollister and his men. The sheriff looked between Hayes and Rebecca with knowing eyes. Miss Vaughn, he said, I take it you're not willingly accompanying these men to Chicago? No, Sheriff, she confirmed. They abducted me from the ranch. Mr. Murphy tried to stop them and was injured in the process. Wilson nodded. That's kidnapping in any territory. They'll face a judge in Helena. He glanced at Hollister, who was seething with barely contained rage. As for any claims of engagement, Montana law doesn't recognize forced matrimony. The lady's choice stands. Hollister struggled against the deputy's grip. This isn't over, Rebecca, he spat. You belong in Chicago, with your own kind. Not in this wilderness with an uncultured rancher. Rebecca straightened her shoulders, facing her tormentor directly. You never understood, James. I don't belong to anyone but myself. And I've found where I belong. She glanced at Hayes, something soft and certain in her expression. Crooked Pine is my home now. The ride back to the ranch passed in relative silence, both Hayes and Rebecca absorbed in their own thoughts. The aftermath of violence and fear had left them drained, yet Hayes felt a curious lightness beneath his exhaustion. Rebecca was safe. She had chosen to stay. When they reached Crooked Pine, they found Finn recovered enough to have organized the cleanup of the ransacked house. The barn damage had been minimal, and the small fire extinguished before it could spread. The physical wounds would heal quickly, but Hayes knew the sense of violation would linger longer. That evening, after the immediate repairs were handled and a semblance of order restored, Hayes found Rebecca on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. She had changed into a clean dress of soft blue cotton, her hair loosely braided over one shoulder. "How are you feeling?" he asked, joining her at the railing. "Strangely at peace," she replied after a moment's consideration. "For so long, I've been looking over my shoulder, waiting for James to find me. Now that he has, and failed, I feel as though a weight has lifted." Hayes studied her profile, marveling at her resilience. "You were very brave today." She turned to face him, her expression serious. "So were you. You risked your life to save me." "I couldn't let him take you," Hayes admitted. The walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart were crumbling, and he no longer had the strength or desire to rebuild them. "Not when I've only just found you." Rebecca's eyes widened slightly. "What do you mean?" Hayes struggled to find the right words. He was a man of action, not eloquence, but some things needed saying. "When you rode into Crooked Pine 3 months ago, I thought you were a temporary inconvenience. I was determined to send you away as soon as possible." "I remember," she said with a small smile. "You were quite clear on that point." "I was wrong," Hayes continued. "About many things. I convinced myself that attachment was weakness, that caring for someone meant inevitable pain." He took a deep breath. "Today, when I saw that empty house and realized Hollister had taken you, I understood that the real pain would be never having known you at all." Rebecca's eyes glistened in the fading light. "Hayes, I'm not offering pretty words or grand promises," he said quickly. "Just the truth, plain as I can speak it. You've brought life back to this ranch, and to me. If you choose to stay at Crooked Pine, I'd like it to be not as my housekeeper, but as—" He faltered, suddenly uncertain. Rebecca stepped closer, her hand coming to rest lightly on his arm. "As what, Hayes Barrett?" she prompted softly. "As my wife." He finished, the words emerging with surprising ease once he'd found the courage to speak them. "If you'll have me." For a heart-stopping moment, Rebecca was silent, her expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. Then she moved forward, closing the distance between them until Hayes could see the flecks of amber in her green eyes. "I rode into your ranch looking for sanctuary," she said. "I wasn't expecting to find a home, or a heart to match my own." Hayes felt hope rising in his chest. "Is that a yes?" Rebecca's smile bloomed, radiant as the first wildflowers after winter. "Yes, Hayes Barrett. I'll stay at Crooked Pine as your wife. Not because I need protection or sanctuary, but because I love you." Hayes pulled her gently into his arms, still hardly believing this wasn't some fever dream. "I love you too, Rebecca. I think I have since you stood in my kitchen and told me no one should live as I was living." Her laughter was soft against his chest. "You were so stubborn. I thought you'd never admit you needed anyone." "I didn't just need someone," he murmured, tilting her face up to his. "I needed you." Their kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with the release of months of unspoken longing. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, the first stars had appeared in the darkening sky above the mountains. 1 year later, Crooked Pine Ranch hosted a gathering unlike any seen in that part of the Montana Territory. Neighbors from miles around came to celebrate the official opening of the Crooked Pine School, a small but sturdy building adjacent to the ranch house, where Rebecca Barrett would teach the children of nearby homesteaders. The school had been Hayes's wedding gift to his bride, built with his own hands during the winter months when ranch work slowed. It represented everything Rebecca had brought to the valley: learning, culture, community, and hope for the future. As dusk fell and lanterns were lit for dancing, Rebecca found a moment to slip away from the festivities. Hayes discovered her at their favorite spot overlooking the valley, one hand resting lightly on her slightly rounded belly. Evidence of the child who would arrive before the first snow. "Hiding from your admirers?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Rebecca leaned back against his chest, "Just catching my breath and admiring what we've built together." Below them, Crooked Pine Ranch spread across the valley, transformed from a struggling operation to a thriving community center. The barn had been expanded, the bunkhouse improved, and 3 new families had settled on parcels Hayes had sold from his vast holdings. "When you rode in that day," Hayes mused, "I thought you'd bring nothing but complication to my life." "I did," Rebecca laughed, turning in his arms. "The best kind of complication." Hayes touched her cheek gently, still sometimes amazed that this extraordinary woman had chosen him. Chosen this life they were creating together. "Any regrets?" "About Chicago, the city, the life you left behind?" Rebecca shook her head, her eyes clear and certain. "Not one. Everything I need is right here, under these western skies." As they returned to the celebration hand in hand, Hayes reflected on how completely his perspective had changed. He had once believed the frontier demanded isolation, that survival required emotional detachment. Rebecca had shown him a greater truth, that the vast wilderness of Montana was conquered not by solitary strength, but by hearts joined in common purpose. The night air filled with music and laughter as neighbors danced beneath stars that seemed to hang just beyond reach. And in that moment, surrounded by the community they were building together, Hayes knew with absolute certainty that the greatest fortune he'd ever discovered wasn't gold or cattle or land, but the love that had ridden into his lonely ranch one fateful afternoon, forever changing the course of his life under the endless western sky.